All right. Uh, so thanks everybody for coming. It is my pleasure to introduce Clemo, who's going to be talking about his PhD research on interactions between sediment mechanical structure and infaunal community structure following physical disturbance. And Cy just finished his PhD in my lab a few months ago, and he's now a postdoc at the Naval Research Lab in Stennis, Mississippi. Um, Go ahead. Cy.
All right, thanks a lot, Kelly. Thanks everyone for coming today. Um, Before we begin, I'd like to quickly acknowledge a lot of help on this project, funding from Office of Naval Research and National Science Foundation, in addition to a ton of help from, first and foremost, Kelly and my dissertation committee, as well as help from a lot of sediment ecology lab members, Dauphin Island Sea Lab tech support and boat captains, and a bunch of other people that helped a lot in sampling and processing and things. So, as many of us know, next to the ocean water column itself, marine sediments are the largest habitats on Earth, and they're home to diverse and abundant burrowing animals that we call infauna, including things like worms, clams, brittle stars, and shrimp. And their movement and feeding activities mix the upper centimeters of sediment, which can impact sediment water nutrient cycling, carbon storage, and pollutant burial. So in the northern Gulf of Mexico, coastal Alabama is this little bit right here, and it's between kind of the muddy sediments of the Mississippi River and the sands of Florida. And it's south of Mobile Bay, which actually drains the sixth largest river system in the U.S. And results in the second highest freshwater discharge to the Gulf of Mexico after the Mississippi Atchafalaya system. So suspended sediment actually often exits the bay and it kind of flows westward, and it results in this transition from muds in the west and cleaner sands moving towards Florida. And these shallow river influenced sediments receive and retain the majority of terrestrially derived sediment compared to other parts of the ocean, which makes these sediments especially important to global nutrient cycling and organic matter processing, despite their small aerial cover. Here on the northern Gulf, our coasts and their sediments are also strongly impacted by frequent storms and the occasional hurricane or tropical cyclone, and we really don't need to fabricate potential impacts like some people with Sharpies have done in the past. So these physical disturbances can cause major sediment resuspension, and it often turns our coastal waters into something resembling chocolate milk. And especially for those of you that work and live on the coast, extreme storms can erode the very ground from under our feet, and it can cause permanent sand loss from barrier islands. This storm-induced resuspension and transport can result in sediment structure that's completely different from the pre-storm sediment. And with hurricane intensity expected to be increasing with global warming, coastal sediments may experience heavier disturbance in the future. So it's especially important to understand impacts to coastal sediments, not only from biogeochemical cycling standpoint, but also for coastal engineering applications such as channel maintenance and coastal resiliency. So physical reworking of the sediment by storms can resuspend and smother infauna living there, but some animals may do better than others, with hard-bodied or more mobile animals likely resisting disturbance better than sessile animals or those with brittle bodies. And infaunal activity can have variable impacts on sediment structure, but little is known about how infaunal communities recover after hurricanes and also how these recovering animals impact sediment stability. So overall, my dissertation work focused on addressing how infaunal communities recover when they and their sediment habitat are physically disturbed. So studying natural physical disturbances, as you can imagine, is hard because they're unpredictable and there are obvious difficulties sampling during such a destructive event. So my approach was to first kind of simulate a storm disturbance in the lab to study short-term structural changes at a kind of a higher resolution. And then I was fortunate and was able to investigate the impacts of hurricanes on Alabama coastal sediments and their infaunal communities. So that's kind of how I divided up my chapters there. Okay, so we'll start with kind of the biological effects on disturbed mud structure. And here our study really focused on how different geological and geotechnical properties of natural cohesive sediments and ice sticky muds changed over time following disturbance, and what role biological versus physical processes play in sediment restrengthening. So many of us here know that natural cohesive muds aren't just grains packed together, but they consist of fine mineral grains kind of bound in a sticky organic matrix. And this matrix is made up of this goo called exopolymeric substances, or EPS, which is this sticky kind of carbohydrate slime, protein slime, exuded by microalgae and microbes. And EPS produced by abundant diatoms in surface sediments and forming these biofilms has been shown to reduce erosion of surface sediments, but there really is little known about kind of the role of surface or subsurface EPS and what it plays in physically disturbed mud re-strengthening, which may be especially important for subtidal muds in turbid waters that aren't going to have these well-developed microalgal biofilms. So on a nice cold, rainy day in late January, there's my lab mate Chesna looking thrilled about it. We collected sediment cores from muddy sediments at 10 meters depth offshore of Dauphin Island on the Alabama coast using a multi-core. And we wanted to see, whoops, spoiler. We wanted to see how disturbed mud regained its cohesive structure. So in the lab, we used a very high-tech turkey baster to we used it to disturb the top 5 centimeters of each sediment core for every hour for 12 hours. And the time and depth were chosen because 12 hours is kind of on the time scales of hurricanes passing over the continental shelf, while the 5 centimeters is half the global average biologically mixed layer, and it's within range of hurricane disturbance, hurricane mixing depths. So it would probably affect smaller animals living near the surface more so than larger animals that may survive and live on to affect sediment properties. So we sampled 4 to 5 cores for sediment properties daily for the first 3 days, and then weekly out to 1 month after resuspending. So this is kind of a schematic diagram of sediment stability changing over time after disturbance, where we expected that post-disturbance sediment physical compaction, or just the physical packing of grains, would occur rapidly and stabilize faster than overall cohesion, which is the stickiness of the sediment that is due to both increasing compaction and slower biological processes producing that goo. So throughout this chapter, I'm kind of going to go first, I'm going to present the methods that we did for compaction and the results, and then move on to the methods and results for analyzing cohesion. So overall, we expected that changes to properties related to mud cohesion would continue to occur after sediment compaction was stable. And again, compaction is this increasing packing of grains over time due to the settling sediment weight. To quantify this, we measured sediment water interface height relative to the undisturbed height at several time points after resuspension. And this kind of provided a nice continuous and non-destructive metric of short and long-term compaction. So we expected that decreasing sediment water interface height to directly show that compaction. To examine physical compaction non-destructively at different depths in the sediment, we also looked at sound speed through sediment. And this graph shows the ratio of sound speed in water versus sediment, the ratio of water sound speed to sediment sound speed in relation to sediment porosity, which is the amount of water in the sediment. And we compared sound speed in sediment to water because sound speed depends on the temperature and the salinity of water. So that's why we have that ratio there. And in general, muds have more water and are thus higher porosity and lower density than sands. And in most sediments, decreasing porosity results in faster sound speed. So we expected that the sound speed ratio would increase over time as the sediment compacted. And finally, to measure porosity and grain size distribution, we took a subcore out of the same core to 10 centimeters depth and sectioned it in 1 centimeter increments, expecting that the porosity or the sediment water content would decrease with increased compaction. I think that grain size distribution would indicate the initial mixing, but then wouldn't really change that much over time after disturbance. All right, so we'll look at some compaction results. Here we have average sediment water interface height relative to the pre-disturbance height against time, where kind of greater than 0 means the sediment is less compact than it was before disturbance. And we expected that the physical compaction would occur relatively rapidly. And this measurement showed that where the sediment water interface height dropped rapidly kind of over the first day, stabilizing pretty close to the original sediment water interface height between 1 and 2 days. Oops, sorry. Okay, yeah. We expected that porosity measurements would reflect this compaction, but if we compare porosity over time at 2 depths, here at 3 centimeters and 5 centimeters, it didn't really capture this initial rapid consolidation over the first day or two. Porosity was highly variable, and differences among time points were not significant. And additionally, we excluded the day 1 porosity because the sediment was still so fluid that we could see it compact as we were taking the subcore. And the grain size, as we expected, remained homogeneous after the disturbance. All right, so we observed a slightly different pattern than that in our sound speed measurements. And again, I'm going to show you this sound speed ratio versus porosity graph with data from a wide range of sediments. And a reminder that the higher the sound speed ratio, the faster the sound, which indicates increasing density. And as our disturbed sandy muds compact, we would expect to see sound speed ratio increase. So if we add our data, our measurements of porosity and sound speed from days 3 through 30 within the disturbed layer, so in that 5 centimeters, we see that the difference in sound speed and porosity are pretty small relative to lots of other measurements. If we zoom in, though, we can see that the sound speed appeared to slightly increase from day 3 to day 14 as porosity decreased, while sound speed ratio between days 14 and 30 actually decreased while, excuse me. Yeah, it decreased as porosity increased, showing that this increasing and then decreasing density, which was surprising given the kind of rapid compaction observed in previous measurements. So the sediment water, overall, the sediment water interface height and the acoustic measurements were non-destructive and kind of appeared to be more effective methods for these small and rapid physical changes than destructive coring for porosity and grain size. And so now we can look at our cohesive variables. So we expected changes to cohesion would continue after compaction stabilized. So we measured changes in properties that might kind of integrate this physical and biological contributors to cohesion. We also expected that cohesion of the sediment surface would change at a different rate than the bulk subsurface. So we measured properties that differentiated between surface and subsurface cohesion. So to first examine changes to surface cohesion, we measured erosion using this custom-built Goost erosion chamber, where it exposes sediment cores to increasing intervals of increasing shear stress, which is the force exerted by moving water on the sediment surface. And this device uses a little spinning disc and pump in the middle to exert shear stress on the sediment surface. And then we measured the turbidity of the eroded material as it pumped through a sensor. And then we filtered this to measure the total eroded mass for each shear level, expecting that erosion would reduce over time. We also expected subsurface cohesion to increase over time after disturbance. And to quantify this, we measured the tensile force of the sediment with a custom probe developed by Kelly and Grant that screws into the mud, and it then pulls up and breaks off a little mud plug. And so the more cohesive the sediment is, it should require more tensile force to break. So we expected max tensile force to increase over time. And to determine if differences in surface and subsurface cohesion changes were driven by this microbial EPS variability, we measured this sediment-bound EPS carbohydrate concentration, again, expecting that the sediment-bound EPS would link surface and subsurface cohesion changes. Okay, now if we look first qualitatively at erosion, we can see that it appears that erosion goes down over time. So here we have a video of a day 1 core at 0.6 pascals of shear stress. The second core is day 7, the third is day 30 at the same shear stresses. And we can see that in general, the water kind of gets clearer over time. So if we look at first at the turbidity sensor data, we also see this decline in murkiness of the water. So at several points during the erosion experiment, the turbidity often exceeded the threshold sensor. So here I've actually just plotted the proportion of time that the murkiness of the water exceeded the threshold at each shear stress level, which are shown in these different gray shades over the different time points. So a little more qualitative here, but it still demonstrates that this steady decline in turbidity over time, which suggests, as we expected, this increasing surface cohesion that continues past the first few days. We expected the same trend in the filtered eroded mass that we did at the end of each shear level, but if we look at the total eroded mass over time, we see kind of a different pattern emerge. There first appears to be a large drop between day 1 and day 2, and then eroded mass actually remains low and relatively stable between day 2 and 2 weeks after disturbance, again, suggesting increasing surface cohesion. But by day 30, the eroded mass appears to increase again, and it's pretty variable again. So why do we see this? Whoops. So why do we see this discrepancy in, sorry, some issues here. Why do we see this discrepancy between the turbidity and eroded mass? So if we go back to what erosion looked like at different times, we can begin to explain this. So on day 1, erosion of smaller, kind of more loosely aggregated particles created this murky water. Day 7, it's a little less murky, but you can see there's still kind of scour on the surface, these little furrows. Then by day 30, the water's a lot less murky, but there's now a lot of mass being picked up again. And this time, much of the eroded mass was actually in the form of these compact worm poop pellets produced by small capitellid and spionid worms. Created this nice worm poop tornado going on there. So we really hadn't expected much activity in these cores because we collected them again in January, midwinter, and just looking initially at the cores we collected, we really didn't see much visible activity because our goal was to really focus on natural mud with few animals, and then in later experiments, try to add in fauna to compare. But after a few weeks, we noticed these tubes and poop mounds kind of pop up. And so we're thinking that some of these worms may have matured from juveniles or slowly reestablished burrows and tubes to produce all these fecal mounds and pellets. And so combined, these data really suggest increasing overall surface cohesion, but increasing pellet production by worms at later time points. So given this apparent increase in surface cohesion based on reduced turbidity and eroded mass until day 30, we expected this primarily to come from this increasing EPS slime stabilizing the sediment. Instead, if we look at the concentration of EPS over time, um, in the top centimeter of sediment, it was highly variable and there were no significant differences over time. So now we'll look at the subsurface cohesion of the sediment, where we have max tensile force over time at 3, 4, and 7 centimeters depth, which are subsurface depths kind of within and below the disturbed layer. So at 3 centimeters, max force kind of increased until stabilizing around 21 days after disturbance, while the force at 4 and 7 centimeters did not appear to stabilize. In fact, the max tensile force at 4 centimeters continued to increase throughout the whole period. The max tensile force at 7 centimeters was much higher, as you can see by the different scale there. And this is likely a result of just the overlying weight of the sediment at that depth. But again, there was no significant differences among the time points at this depth. And so again, if we compare this to what the EPS was doing at these different depths, we again see high variability and no significant change over time. So overall, turbidity and eroded mass did not behave the same due to probably worm activity, changing the erosion from these loose particles to compact pellets over time. And the EPS concentration overall did not really relate to cohesion. But this makes sense because resuspension likely would not have really changed the amount of EPS, but rather chopped up the sediment EPS matrix. Okay, so combined, the compaction and cohesion data suggest a disturbance recovery scenario in which even these small-bodied capitellid and spionid worms play an important role in changing sediment structure. So here we kind of have schematic diagrams of what compaction and cohesion were doing over time. And again, we expected that compaction to increase faster than cohesion, and that surface and subsurface cohesion would change at different rates. And at first, compaction and cohesion they both kind of increased for 2 weeks after resuspension, with cohesion overall increasing more rapidly initially. And this is in part shown by the erosion visibly declining over time here between day 1 and day 7 after disturbance. But between 2 and 4 weeks, while subsurface cohesion continued to increase and turbidity decreased, compaction decreased and eroded mass increased. And this may have actually resulted from a lag in infaunal growth and recovery, kind of leading to increased burrow space and accumulating pellets, at the same time as increasing cohesion by more microbial stimulation or simply burrow wall compaction. But this work really demonstrates the importance, whoopsie daisy. This work really demonstrates the importance of including biological parameters when predicting post-disturbance recovery of sediment structure, even in heavily disturbed sediments that may not have that much infauna. Okay, so based on chapter 1, the findings of chapter 1, for the rest of my dissertation, I wanted to focus on how natural infaunal communities and their sediment habitats are impacted by storms and hurricanes. So I was interested in how hurricane disturbance restructured the sediment, and then whether the sediment structure change impacted infaunal community structure. So during hurricane season of 2020, again, off the Alabama coast here, I plan to sample across an kind of expected sediment gradient and depth gradient where with the expectation that in the event of a hurricane, sediments and communities at these shallow 5-meter sites would already normally be frequently disturbed. And at these 12-meter sites would probably be pretty heavily disturbed by a hurricane, while 20-meter sites may be too deep to be disturbed a lot. So the timing of my sampling was pretty fortuitous because not only were we dealing with a global pandemic in 2020, but we had one of the most active Atlantic hurricane seasons yet. And so in early September, given the state of the Atlantic, I decided I'd better get moving and sample those sites. 6 days later, Hurricane Sally made landfall near Gulf Shores, Alabama on September 16th, 2020. and passed almost directly over our 9 sites right here, not to mention my house, which wasn't as fun. But this map kind of shows the locations and area of the wind speeds of Hurricane Sally. It was crossing the shelf. So this storm was 1 knot short of a Category 3 hurricane, which is considered a major hurricane, and it generated waves over 8 meters high. So this is a graph of bottom currents and the colors with depth at 20 meters, kind of measured offshore of Dauphin Island at this site. And as Sally crossed the shelf, the currents actually exceeded 1.5 meters per second. So picture a 20-meter wall of water moving at about twice the speed that, at least at Dauphin Island Sea Lab, we have to swim to pass the scientific diving test. Although it's not as fast as Michael Phelps, so somewhere in between. But a little bit over a month later, Hurricane Zeta then hit down here at Louisiana, but we still had high winds and over 6 meter waves off the Alabama coast. Although the period of high waves was much shorter than Sally, and the bottom currents were quite a bit lower. But over a 6-week period, based on this graph of wave heights over time, we actually had the first and second highest wave heights in the last 12 years. So we resampled those 9 sites, 4 of which I'll present today in the interest of time, 10 days after Sally, and then again in late October, before Zeta, 6 weeks after Zeta in December, and in late February and late May. And we collected diver sediment cores to assess how sediment properties and infauna abundance, diversity, and community structure changed over time. We also estimated physical forcing by the hurricanes on the seafloor by estimating near bed, wave, and current generated shear stress. So a little bit of background first. Waves and currents drive sediment resuspension and transport. So the seafloor slows and compresses the orbital motion of waves, which results in a kind of a back and forth motion at the sediment surface, which can loosen and resuspend the sediment. Currents, on the other hand, exert this unidirectional force, unidirectional shear stress on the sediment surface, and are primarily responsible for moving resuspended sediment. So if a hurricane generates both strong waves and strong currents, we would expect a lot of sediment movement. So here, these are graphs of estimated wave-generated shear stress at all sites from hindcast wave data and current-generated shear stress at 20-meter sites based on current measurements made at this site here and over time during Sally. And we found that Hurricane Sally generated enough physical forcing to resuspend coarse sands at all sites for periods ranging from 12 hours to several days, in addition to this high current shear stress. And in contrast to Sally, we couldn't reliably estimate current shear stress and the duration of high wave shear stress was much shorter than Sally during Zeta at all the sites. So since we had both high wave shear stress and during both storms, we may expect to see sedimentary changes such as winnowing of mud, where fine-grained sediment is washed away while coarser sand is left behind. And during Sally, we had very strong currents, so we might expect to see lots of sand transport and deposition. So what did our sites look like 10 days after this storm? So these graphs show mean grain size with sediment depth 6 days before Sally at 2 20-meter sites, and the shapes by on the graph they show the sampling time point. And here grain size is shown in phi, where the finer the grain size, the actually bigger the phi. So it's a little confusing, but and then the sorting is shown by the dashed lines on either side of the mean grain size. And then this color gradient actually shows the percent sample in each size class of that sample. So 10 days after Sally, the Western 20-meter sites displayed coarser and kind of better sorted surface layers, while the middle 20-meter site shifted from poorly sorted mud to before Sally to kind of a homogeneous 7 centimeter layer of sand over mud after Sally. So let's link those changes in these different grain size characteristics to wave and current forcing during a hurricane. So here's kind of an example of a profile of grain size with depth similar to the data I just showed, where mean grain size, that's just the mean size. But what about things like sorting and skewness and those weird words that you might have learned in geology class long ago? Well, if we look at the distribution of grain sizes at like a single depth here, so here we have kind of the size class on the x-axis and the percent of the sample in that size class on the y-axis. And we can see that the mean grain size and sorting here, and the sorting is basically just the standard deviation. We can also see the distribution is being pulled or skewed more towards fine sediment. So now if we think about how a storm might change the grain size distribution, we might expect large waves winnowing mud to kind of leave behind coarser, better sorted, and normally distributed sediment, but not really a big shift in mean grain size. Strong waves combined with strong currents, though, may resuspend and transport sand from shallower areas offshore, which may result in kind of a distinct, well-sorted, normally distributed sand layer deposited over sediment similar to pre-storm composition. All right, let's go back to some data here. So at this W20 site, it appears that there was winnowing of the surface during Sally, and this plot of grain size distribution of the top centimeter shows that you can see the finer tail, the black finer tail is gone after Sally at this depth. At M20, there could have been sand transported and deposited at this site by Sally's strong currents, resulting in homogeneous, well-sorted, and more evenly distributed sand after Sally, which was overlying muddier sediment similar to pre-Sally mud. And this drastic shift in grain size, sorting and skewness can be seen in the difference between distributions at 3 centimeters at M20 before and after Sally. 10 days after Sally, though, other sites showed few sediment impacts in response to the storm. So grain size distribution appeared to change little after Sally at M05, which is a shallow 5-meter sandy site. But surprisingly, muddy sediment at the westernmost 12-meter site also appeared to change little relatively, and it remained poorly sorted and finely skewed muddy sediment. The sedimentary changes that occurred after Sally remain mostly unperturbed, even following Hurricane Zeta and strong winds and freshwater outflow out of Mobile Bay during the winter and spring. So at W20, that winnowed surface mud never really returned, and the site remains sandy and relatively unchanged from before or after Zeta out to late May 2021. The sand layers likely deposited by Sally at M20 also persisted. There was some layer thickness change that could have just been due to additional deposition or simply spatial variability. But by late May, the sand layer was still pretty similar to the sand layer that was there 10 days after Sally. And again, the shallow sandy site and 12-meter deep muddy site did not exhibit notable changes during this time. So the apparent sand concentration, or the concentration of sand delivery to some sites and not others during Sally may be attributed to storm flow interacting with local bathymetry. So at the mouth of Mobile Bay, there's a prominent ebb tidal delta where sediment is deposited as the tide goes out. And this feature actually creates this southward dip or bend in the bathymetry here. And the strong west-southwest currents during Sally may have been transporting shallow sand from the east, but the ebb tidal delta may have actually deflected the currents offshore, resulting in sand delivery to these sites here, but disrupting transport to the western sites. For my third chapter, I wanted to see if the infaunal community structure reflected the small-scale spatial variability of the storm impacts to sediment structure we observed previously or during Sally. So we hypothesized that sites experiencing little sediment change after Sally, their infaunal communities would bounce back relatively quickly, and the community after Sally would look pretty similar to that before the storm. We also expected community structure to fluctuate with sediment composition at sites that were experiencing sedimentary change outside of storm impacts. And then finally, we hypothesized that the post-storm community structure would decline the most and remain quite different from the pre-storm community at sites experiencing drastic and more long-lasting storm sediment change. So to begin analyzing community structure changes, we first compared how similar communities were between samples. So all the different abundances of all the taxa in each sample were compared between each pair of samples. For example, if we compare three communities here, based on the taxa present and the number of each taxon, we can see that communities A and B are more similar than either communities B and C or A and C. And these comparisons result in dissimilarity values for each pair of comparisons. And in this case, we calculated Bray-Curtis similarity. So we then use non-metric multidimensional scaling, or NMDS, and permutational analysis of variance, or PerManova, to analyze these dissimilarity values. So NMDS maps the samples based on their distance from or dissimilarity to the other samples. And this is performed in many dimensions, but it's generally displayed on kind of two unitless axes. For example, say we have a hypothetical set of samples from different sediment types, such as muds here in circles, and then sands in squares. And we see the replicates from each sediment type are kind of clustering closer together and therefore are more similar in community structure. We may expect that if there's a big sediment change, for example, if sand is deposited at the muddy site while the sandy site does not change much, the pre and post disturbance communities that at the previously muddy site may be more dissimilar than those at the sandy site. And the post-storm communities at the two sites may also be more similar now that they've both been disturbed, but the muddy site is now similarly sandy. We can also use PerManova to assess whether there are statistically significant differences between groups of samples. For example, if the pre and post-storm communities are different. So after identifying over 6,500 infauna, we compared community structure dissimilarity at all of our sites and time points and assessed whether water depth, sediment type, or time sampled influence community structure differences. And in general, they did not. We just got a big old mess when we did this. So, after staring at this like a crazy person for a little while, I decided to kind of go back and just look at temporal changes kind of site by site. So this is kind of what we have here. We have NMDS plots at each site and time point in the colors, but even splitting up the community structure comparisons into sites still showed no clear changes to community structure based on sediment disturbance by hurricanes. There were no significant differences in community structure at this W12 muddy site, which was expected because there was little sediment change, but neither W20 or M20 communities were significantly dissimilar from each other at any time point, even though they had larger sediment changes after the storm. And furthermore, although MO5 sands remained similar throughout the study area, it was one of the only sites to show the significant temporal differences in community similarity. In fact, most sites had such high 2D stress, which is basically the distortion of the data trying to force it into 2D, that these visualizations are essentially garbage. They're just unreliable for the most part. Still, we wanted to further explore temporal changes to infauna. So we then examined how macrofaunal abundance and diversity changed over time after Hurricane Sally. So the classic succession model of how infaunal abundance and diversity change after disturbance over time um, was, proposed. It's been proposed generally by a lot of workers, but for sediment communities by Pearson and Rosenberg for hypoxia caused by organic enrichment. But it's also been applied to community recovery following physical disturbance. And in general, following a disturbance, we would expect to see an immediate drop in abundance, then kind of a peak of opportunists where we have high numbers of fast reproducing or hardy taxa that have little competition, which is generally followed by lower abundance, but lots of different taxa as conditions improve and the slower reproducing and less tolerant recruits move in and compete with opportunists. Then abundance and diversity may stabilize to the quote unquote normal community, although this may depend on the seasonal dynamics of infauna. And we also hypothesize that the community may be very different from the pre-storm community if the sediment structure changes. Many past studies investigating storm impacts to infauna have actually attributed the negative impacts to reduced salinity and low oxygen after heavy rain and runoff. But our study area experienced very little salinity change or low oxygen. So this is a graph of dissolved oxygen at 20 meters depth off of Dolphin Island over time. And you can see my sampling points and the shapes there. And there was very little hypoxia, which is below 2 milligrams per liter, before or during our study period. So we really expected that the primary disturbing force would be the sediment disturbance. So for each sample, we calculated abundance, the number of taxa or richness, Shannon diversity, which accounts for the proportion of total abundance contributed to by each taxon, Simpson diversity, which is similar to Shannon, but it gives more weight to the most abundant taxa, and Pilau's evenness, which measures how evenly distributed the abundances of each taxa in a community are. So this is a big graph of those diversity metrics over time for the sites shown by these colored box plots. And we see that the W12 muds, which remain mostly unchanged after Sally, also had little change to abundance or diversity. There was a significant change in community structure 10 days after Sally at MO5, one of the shallow sandy sites that didn't really change much after Sally. But surprisingly, this was in the form of a significant increase in abundance, not decline. And these are graphs of the top, the most numerically dominant families of infauna that we found here over time. And we see that this abundance increase was driven by the appearance of pinnotherid crabs, but mostly by these huge increases in gemma gemma, which is an opportunistic venerid clam. Gemma gemma is often one of the dominant taxa in sandy areas kind of within Mobile Bay and Mississippi Sound. So it may have actually been resuspended in the bay and kind of transported offshore by Sally. 6 weeks later, Hurricane Zeta impacted the area, but the only apparent significant impact was a decline in abundance, likely due to, again, this reduced gemma gemma abundance. Otherwise, there was no significant changes to other measures of diversity after either storm. Despite surface mud winnowing and thick sand deposition at W20 and M20, in contrast to our hypotheses, there were no significant changes to total abundance or diversity at sites experiencing post-Sally sediment change 10 days after Sally or in December after Zeta. Furthermore, the only taxa to display significant changes after the hurricanes were the disappearance of spionids and appearance of peronids at site M20. And similar to gemma gemma at MO5, a species of peronid was also dominant in inshore areas and may have been displaced by the hurricane to M20 from shallower sediments. However, spionids returned to the site after Zeta, suggesting little overall impact of storm winnowing and sand deposition on fauna. Excuse me. Surprisingly, there were a few significant impacts to in-faunal community structure after two of the most intense storms in the past decade. But this may suggest that the communities in this area are resistant to physical disturbance, and many of the top taxa have been previously designated as opportunistic. But again, this was from the most recent survey, which was done in 1979. Our pre-storm sampling was also in early September, and the community may have just already been in decline after a long and hot summer because kind of late August, early September can still be pretty gross down on the Gulf Coast. Furthermore, let's not forget how stormy 2020 was in the Atlantic. Tropical storms Cristobal and Marco hit Louisiana before our initial sampling and led to pretty high significant wave heights at our study site. And then finally, many taxa in the Gulf of Mexico experienced declines in the fall and late winter, and then recruit in the or early winter, then recruit in the late winter, early spring. So perhaps the sediment changes we observed would be more important during springtime recruitment. With that in mind, let's look at community changes over the winter and into the spring. So at site W12, the muds remain mostly unchanged throughout the study period, along with abundance and diversity, until there were increases in abundance, richness, and decline in evenness in late May. And this was probably driven by significant increases in capitellid worms, which dominated abundance at this site in May. That's shown in the orange there. MO5 remained sandy throughout the study period and had greater abundance in February than before Sally. And this was driven by peaks in spionid, peronid, and nephtid worms. And this may have potentially resulted from that late winter recruitment of those and other taxa. At the 20-meter sites with these long-lasting sedimentary changes after Sally, there were some abundance and diversity increases in late winter and spring. At M20, there was significantly higher abundance than either after Sally or after Zeta in February. And this increased abundance included peaks of lumbernerid worms, Gulfingiids, sipunculids, and brittle stars that may have been supported by a surface mud increase seen in some cores in late February. A few days after our final sampling in late May, though, or before our final sampling, there were actually unusually strong winds that generated almost a week of pretty high waves. And this coincided with the loss of surface mud and several of the taxa that peaked in February at M20, suggesting further sediment disturbance during this windy period. This disturbance wasn't apparent at W20, however, which had low Shannon diversity in late February that coincided with dominance of spionid worms, and then increased by late May as some taxa including talinid clams, decreased in abundance. The hard-shelled talinid clams, increased in abundance. The hard-shelled talinid clams may have been more resistant to potentially erosive conditions in mid-May than the softer-bodied or brittle animals. But overall, changes to in-faunal community structure and abundance showed no clear relationship directly or long after hurricane-induced sediment changes. So Hurricanes Sally and Zeta were the first and second most intense storms to impact coastal Alabama in the last 12 years, resulting in spatially variable impacts to sediment structure. So at some sites, there were substantial and long-lasting losses of surface mud and sand deposition that was influenced by local bathymetry, while other sites change very little. These sands and muds change very little. Despite high wave and current shear stresses and dramatic changes to the sediment habitat at some sites, though, in-faunal communities at most sites didn't change substantially. And excuse me. This apparent resistance to extreme events likely results from the community already being in a state of decline due to previous storms, anthropogenic impacts, and seasonal population patterns, in addition to being composed mainly of opportunistic taxa adapted to these dynamic river-influenced coastal sediments. And although we showed in chapter 1 that recovery of small opportunistic infauna can significantly change how muddy sediment stabilizes after being disturbed, we're still in the process of using those same tools to investigate how the appearance or disappearance of certain taxa after storm-induced sediment changes influenced sediment stability in the field. However, our data only encompass fall to spring in 1 year, so the seasonal infaunal dynamics during a year without big storms isn't really known. And whether the long-lasting sediment changes at several sites will affect kind of longer-term macrofaunal dynamics outside of our sampling remains to be investigated. But overall, constraining small-scale variability in storm-induced sediment structure changes and how the interaction of seasonal dynamics and disturbance shape infaunal communities will probably be important for predicting how shallow coastal sediment dynamics will be impacted by more intense storms as the climate warms. And thank you. I'll take any questions if I have any time.
Thanks, Cy. We've got a few minutes for questions if anybody has any.
I do. Sorry, I had to figure out how to unmute myself. So with in your first set of experiments where you brought the cores into the lab and incubated them for 30 days, were they were they kept at seawater temperature, or were they warmer than outside?
That's a good thing to bring up. Yeah, they were kept at, room temperature-ish, probably between 20 and 25 degrees C. So yeah, probably a lot warmer than the water they were in when we collected them. And they were kept in the dark too to kind of avoid growth of microalgae.
Sure. What were seawater temperatures at that time? Any idea?
Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, I'd have to go back and look, but I'm guessing they were, at least 5 degrees cooler.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mhm.
My guess is that that influenced what you saw in terms of activity. Certainly,
Could have stimulated what might have been in there.
well, stimulated activity anyway. Lots of the infauna go relatively inert in the wintertime, even if there's food
Mhm.
available.
Okay. Yeah, that would make sense. Yes, Bob.
I'm wondering if you looked at the myofauna at all. In particular, a lot of your measurements were concentrated right at the sediment water interface. And so particularly in the kind of incubations that Sally was just asking about, I would have expected a fair amount of myofaunal activity right in the surface few millimeters. Did
Mm.
you see evidence of that during your incubation series?
Um, I did not collect myofaunal samples. Mainly the reason I didn't collect kind of quantitative infauna or macrofauna or myofauna data was we took a lot of measurements that disturbed the sediment. So we took subcores and fracture probe measurements and erosion from all the same cores. So kind of by the end, it was just kind of a chopped up mess. So based on that and sampling in winter, I kind of, maybe foolishly was kind of assuming we could ignore what the animals were doing, or at least attribute less to them. But just looking at the cores, most like the dominant activity that I saw in kind of 2 weeks and later were probably there's spionid tubes and spionid and capitellid fecal pellet mounds, like just dotting the surface of the cores.
Mhm.
But visually, I couldn't tell you if there was high myofaunal activity. I did sort of related with the offshore sampling for the other two chapters we did. There were several periods where I found very high abundance of diastylid cumations, which were pretty small. I mean, they were mostly, their body width was mostly less than a millimeter. And I know they kind of like to screw around in that fluff layer, right? So, but I don't recall seeing many cumations zooming around in those cores.
So I also have a question about since you do have bivalves in your samples, and you mentioned gemma gemma at least. Um,
Mhm.
I'm wondering if during the erosional events if you saw any evidence of shell layer formation or surface armoring by shells. And I'm asking that in part because it's a very common feature to see during erosion events, getting lag layers of shells, which then affect a lot of the physical properties of the
Mhm.
surface
Mhm.
subsequent erosion. And it's also quite a common feature in the geologic record when you're looking at storm events. It's very common to see shell aggregation
Right.
in layers. And I'm just wondering if you saw anything like that, or are basically all your shells dissolved anyway? Are they just gone?
Um, I don't, there was, so some of the sandier, like the 5 meter sandy sites, they sometimes had a few like chunks of, yeah, shell or, um, sand dollar test pieces. But there was never any like visible lag layer, like and like the gravel content of all these sediment samples, which, in this setting, I'm like gravel equals shell, basically. Um, Bigger than 2 millimeter pieces it was never a large portion of the sediment sample. Um, Generally less than 1% of the sample would be composed of anything bigger than 2 millimeters or 1 millimeter. So in the cores, I did not observe that much. Yeah. Um,
Okay.
but again, the cores we took were, 10 centimeter diameter, so it may have been just too small scale to observe that type of feature. I'm not sure.
So do you think, I'm sorry for dominating this. I don't see
Okay.
any other hands, so I'm going to ask a couple more questions, or at least one more. When these events begin and they ramp up, do you think that the infauna flee the interface into the deeper parts of the sediment, and then after the event subsided, the a proportion of them just come right back up to where their normal life habit would be? Have you looked at the response to an event?
I haven't personally like observed that happening. Because the disturbance we did in the first chapter with their special turkey baster, again, like we just did not see, like we didn't see tubes on the side of the cores, or like really much evidence at all that there were things crawling around in there.
Hmm.
But I do know that uh, others have observed escape burrows in post-storm things that happen pretty quickly. Um, and things like Diopetra and big worms that have deep tubes and burrows, they can probably just reestablish pretty quickly, or if they're fast enough, yeah, they may kind of dig down to avoid the erosion and then pop back up shortly after. So yeah, I think that's entirely possible. I will kind of note in mentioning big worms, like most of the animals in this area are tiny, like most of the annelids were less than a millimeter thick. So I really think that this area is just so dynamic and just constantly moving around and having different disturbances that the there's not really a baseline community before the storm. And so, um, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Can we go ahead and wrap up? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And thanks, Cy, for a good talk. And we will have another one of these in about 2 months. So keep an eye on your emails and we will send it out. So, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.